Welcome back, everyone, after the coffee break. We look forward to discuss more together with you all. You recognize people here up front, the panel. We have Regine Boutret from the French Agency for Food, Environmental and Occupational Health and Safety. Melanie Carr from the European Medicines Agency. And from the Maastricht University, Ellen Voss, Professor of European Union Law, and also Leonid Dendle from the German Federal Institution for Risk Assessment. And we do have quite a few questions coming up and comments. So we will try to mix questions we decided to talk about beforehand and questions and suggestions coming up from you all. But a very first question would be whether it's at all possible to ensure some kind of representativeness when it comes to stakeholder engagement. How do you deal with that? To ensure, is it possible to ensure that there's really some kind of representativeness when dealing with different stakeholders? Who would like to start? Yes, please.
Hello. Yeah, I think broad representativeness is very important, and I think you need to really focus on the objective, what you're trying to get out of the engagement, and also think about the method of engagement. For example, if we have a stakeholder event and it's an open call on our website, what we find is often that, you get lots of service providers who immediately click, and there's maybe 100 who want to come. And I think you really have to think about getting the mix right. So maybe saying, well, we want, to have 20 seats reserved for patient representatives, 20 for the industry, big, small, medium size, and take it from there. So it really is making sure you have the right people in the room, but also the balanced representation.
Would you like to add?
Well, yes, I would like to add that, in fact, representativeness is one of the items, but it's not the only one. For example, some organizations have a lot of power, with the media, for example, but sometimes they do not represent many people, so we also have to include these. And so maybe I wouldn't use the word representativeness, but more a balance of views and a balance of interests.
Yes.
It's also your question was about when engaging with stakeholders and the general public. I think it's difficult.
So it's the two of them. We're primarily talking about stakeholder engagement now.
Yes, because in fact, so the general public, I think that is also very difficult and a different question, in fact, to tackle when talking about representation and representativeness. So the general public is very difficult to engage, in fact. So that's something I think we need to discuss also, whether and how we can do that instead of only for the communication, but if we want to really engage with the general public. You see already the composition of the audience here today. There's little representative organization of civil society, as I saw at the first question that Barbara posed. So let aside then the general public. So we should maybe also reflect on that.
Yeah, I think I would second that. I think it's achieving representativeness in engagement is really, really difficult because there are always these power imbalances. So there will always, as I said, always be stakeholders who have more resources to engage than others, and that is something really difficult. I think, that's something we need to overcome, but that is a challenge, and particularly, as I said, or what came out of our survey, considering the general public or the consumer. And I agree, we need to try to find new methods to engage the consumer, because at least in our interviews, quite a few criticize the current approach, which is often by engaging consumers and the general public through NGO representation, through consumer associations, and that was actually criticized by quite a few stakeholders in our interviews, because they felt they not necessarily really represent the public. So I think we have to come up with new methods, and I think social media potentially can play a role there, but yeah.
Yeah, and speaking about methods, you see that there's a question, the two speakers actually mentioned training for stakeholders in engagement processes. Would you like to say a bit more about this training? What does it involve?
Yeah, I can start from that. Yeah, we have at the agency, as I had on one of the slides that I presented, a number of support measures and training opportunities for patients and consumers, but also for healthcare professionals who engage with us. And the idea behind that is to sort of to strip back the complexity, because we operate in quite a complex field in medicines regulation. So it's to understand what the roles of the various committees are and what the expectation is from perhaps a patient expert who's participating in a scientific advisory group or a committee. And it can be rather daunting. So, it just helps put the representative at ease and really maximize the dialogue and what we get out of it. But that having been said, we also, when we were in the public hearing, did some training with the committee, because fair to say that, the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee has been operating pretty much behind closed doors since they were set up. So the thought of opening up and having this discussion with the public in the room was also quite daunting for them. So there's also a level of training to go through for regulators.
Can I just ask, is training the right word in that sense? Because the training seems that they don't know, so you inform, you
yeah, I don't know. I mean, we would say in the info sessions that we run, we sort of call it a training day rather than a dialogue, because it is, for example, running through what a scientific advice looks like, how we operate and that sort of thing. But I suppose you could call it, information.
Maybe.
Yeah, please.
Yes, I also mentioned training sessions. In fact, we do that for a network of an NGO, which has about 40 to 70, depends, people organizing nesting workshop with parents or future parents or pregnant women. So I mentioned we make feedback events, so it's kind of same things, but during two days, we find all the opinions, all the expertise we produced on issues that might be of interest for them, and we explain the same thing, in fact, but it's on 2 days, and it's for a network of NGOs instead of being one-shot feedback events, actually.
So in the interviews, the stakeholders definitely demanded to get, but they didn't use the word training, like pre-information to enable them to participate properly. But I think there is this kind of challenge that you, at the same time, and I think one of the questions mentions that at the same time you need to avoid stakeholder fatigue, so you can't overwhelm them with too much information, and you need to avoid probably calling it training, because you don't want to just kind of influence them in your direction, because you want to enable them to participate, but at the same time you don't want to influence them too much. So it's really a challenge, I think, or it's something you have to deal with as an organization.
Yeah, well, there's also a question coming up with that also, how to strike a balance between minimum and maximum level of engagement to achieve good quality of input and avoid engagement fatigue, what you're referring to. So do you have any good advice on that one? The right balance?
I think it's all about planning as far as possible and really thinking about what you want to get out of the engagement. So, I mean, I must say from the Medicines Agency perspective, I mean, I don't think that we overdo stakeholder engagement. We really do try and focus, because we have limited resources, so we really try and focus on those areas where we really feel that there's a need to engage. And we can consult through writing, and that's something which happens very regularly, and I think it depends on that level of interaction. If you're going to organise a stakeholder meeting or work in a more collaborative space, that's a bit more resource intensive. So it's about getting that balance right as well.
It's of course also possible to raise your hand if you have any comments or questions. So please state who you are first.
Thank you. Oh, I'm Lucia Reich from Copenhagen Business School. I have a little bit, I'm actually referring to one of your talk, Alan. Particularly, it has to do with public engagement, but it's more specific. When you kind of suggested, or not promoted, but suggested like open science approaches, that one of the elements is open access to the results. And I must say that basically I'm very much in favor of it, because we should make transparent certainly our data that also goes to the public agencies. I think in that specific case, the US which is not a good example in many ways these days, but in these days it's an excellent example. I mean, like full disclosure, openness, access to all kind of data. But the Open Access Initiative of the European Commission, I'm not sure whether you're fully aware of that, but there's this new thing that they will force, I mean, like request people who work in their projects to publish only open access. And I think this is a big danger, because it does impact actually the publishers' world. That will certainly promote the already happening, oligopolization of the publishers' world. And this, again, will impact our, diversity and those many, many diverse media outlets where people can actually read about the effect. So I'm hypercritical of that, and I know that there's also green open access, and there's kind of tricks to work around. But I really would love to hear your or the audience's stake on that. I'm not sure whether this is a good idea if you really want to promote diversity and access to results.
Okay, so that's a really large question, the question about open access, good and bad advantages. Do you want to address this a bit?
I could start to address. I think it's a good thing, in fact, the open access, but I see also your problems. And I think with open science, what I said, it's a kind of this engagement in the science making. I also view the problems that if you allow stakeholders really to participate in the science making, that would not be a good thing, because in fact of the influence that could happen also. So in fact what I would advocate is to create these platforms outside of the true, so if we talk about science making, like a panel of EFSA, stakeholders would not really participate in that. And I mean not to participate in meetings, but also talk in meetings, but to have platforms, in fact, where, in fact, a dialogue takes place, and where exchange of ideas, but also views, and also openness about the data that is used. I think that is very important, but open access, yes, I think we have not fully realized maybe also the dangers. And to the universities, we are very much in favor of that. On the other hand, also we see problems in terms of budgets and funding, that we have to pay for open access, etc. So I cannot say more than that at the moment.
Yes.
Do you want to?
Yeah, from our perspective, the publication of informational medicines in peer-reviewed journals is, of course, hugely important. And I suppose we're perhaps quite novices in the open access. We really have just started moving into open access last year because of the budgetary constraints. So we don't, everything that EMA participate in publications, we don't have open access to. We have to be selective for budgetary reasons. And I think we'll have to wait and see what comes out of this Commission proposal.
I would like to put in some more questions coming up in the app, and that's the question of whether it's possible to achieve a balance between the public influence and scientific independence when engaging with society. What do you think about that?
In fact, that's what I told you about, that we were making hearings by expert groups. This is to preserve the expert groups from outside influence, either from activists, either from companies, and so, but they have knowledge. That's why we make hearings, but they do not participate in risk assessment. So that's the way we try and to protect independence of our expertise.
Well, I would say that's one of the biggest challenges, really, to maintain. I guess maintain trust in your organization, and which is at the moment, at least within the current discourse, very much linked to independence, and at the same time meet these demands for engagement. As I mentioned in the presentation, I think there are these very conflicting demands that are put on organizations that are difficult for them to meet. I think Bernhard Ohl actually at one of the events I went to mention that as well, that at the same time you're kind of pushed as a scientist to engage through Horizon 2020 and so forth, and then at the very same time you are not considered independent anymore, and you're not allowed onto certain panels. So it's, I think, a really difficult position many scientists find themselves in.
There's always also the question of how to monitor and how to evaluate if your methods are working. So what measures exist to monitor and assess if engagement was actually successful, so it doesn't just remain a formality as being asked from the audience? So do you know if it works, and how do you evaluate if it works? No one?
I mean, the method that we use regularly is surveys, and I know there are limitations in that, but it is something which is something that can be done relatively easily. What's more difficult to do in the medicines arena is to look at the introduction of risk minimization measure and to then understand has changed the way medicine's used in practice. And that's something which we're working very hard on at the agency, to look at how we might take some case studies and perhaps retrospectively look if a labelling change did made a difference to prescribing habits, for example, or did a healthcare professional letter. But that's something that's more challenging to tackle.
Please.
I think the assessment really much depends on the goals you have as an organization. So if you have, if your main goal with that particular engagement method is a strategic one where you want to increase your reputation or your legitimacy, then the way to assess what you've done is very different to a more kind of pragmatic or instrumental engagement approach where you're essentially trying to extend your knowledge base, and then obviously you have to assess how much knowledge you've gained, and then obviously if you're following more the kind of normative approach, or if you, and I would say it depends where you're as an organization, where you're positioned in the field. If you're an organization that's under a lot of pressure to also meet kind of normative ideals of democracy, then obviously your engagement has to stand up to these type of ideals. So how to assess, I think, really depends on the goals you have with the engagement.
Yes, right. There's one question that's been raised about public hearings, if they also should be held when assessing novel food, new additives, pesticides, health claims. What do you think? Please, Regine.
I would just say a word about the, I mentioned the dialogue committee on nanomaterials. And so that's a permanent dialogue committee, but at the present time we are especially dealing, we have an expert group working on nanomaterials in food. So we currently exchange on research, on the advancement of our risk assessment, but not giving the results, and also coming out with new news on this subject. So I think that's a way to dialogue about including novel food, of course. Mm-hmm. And also the industry and the ANIA, which is the Association of National Agroalimentary for Food in France, is involved in this dialogue committee.
Maybe we should ask you in the audience for the first question. So if you agree with the question, should public hearings also be held when assessing new additives, pesticides, etc.? Do you agree? Please raise your hand. Okay. Thank you. I think a majority didn't raise their hands. Do you have any comments to that?
Well, maybe just, I mean, from a practical perspective, I think it will be very difficult. If you look at the legislative scheme, there is a time path also to be held, and we talk about an authorization procedure for each and every single product, in fact, or novel food products. So I'm not sure if that would be practical feasible also, to have a public hearing organized for each and every novel food that will is going to be submitted for authorization. So maybe a general group. I don't know how that is done with you, in fact. So you had one product selected, or how did you do that?
The public hearings, as we have them now, are really in the safety review setting. So it's not in the initial authorization application. And it really is, as I said, to complement the existing support structures in place, or stakeholder engagement structures. And I think it's it's also important to say that we ask specific questions. The PRAC will only consider a public hearing is warranted if there really is something that they want to gain the public's insight into, and also if the issue that's under investigation and the timeline for the process permits it, because obviously there's some time involved in calling a public hearing, and if it's a very urgent, perhaps new life-threatening side effect, then time doesn't permit us to hold a public hearing on that. It's just not warranted. So it very much is case by case.
There are also questions coming up about the formats. You've been talking a bit about that during your presentations, the format for public hearings and so on. Do you have any specific formats that you really could encourage others to use?
So far we've only used really one format, and we do have, from the Valprate in September, we do have a lessons learned on our website. In terms of challenges that we found, there was a high number of requests for participation for speaking slots, and it was a 6-hour meeting, which I think was long enough. That was our experience. So you do have to manage the speaking time, and also select out those speakers that you're going to have through looking for representative input on the different indications under review, also different input from the different stakeholder perspectives. So we have patients, carers, sometimes victims, the industry is often there, healthcare professionals, and then we run it so that the representatives from the patient groups will start the hearing, and we've allowed sort of 6 to 7 minute speaking slot where patients have similar views. They submit everything in advance in writing, and if possible we will group them, so maybe one person will speak on behalf of 3 or 4 patient representatives or civil society representatives, and then at the end there's sort of open question and answer session. So overall I think the format has worked well, but I think as we gain more experience it will probably evolve, and we'll try and improve it as we go along.
I think what you need is really a variety of formats. So it always depends, as I mentioned before, on your goals. If you have a strategic goal, the format will be a very different one compared to kind of a pressure to meet certain normative standards. So I think you as an organization, you really have to reflect on, okay, how am I positioned in the field? What are the demands on me? What stakeholder am I dealing with? What is the issue? How controversial is the issue? And depending on that, I think you have to decide the format. So there will probably never be a one-size-fits-all format, I think.
Right. So actually there are even more questions than you can see on the screen. So we are picking one of those, which is like this. One could argue that an activist group that is not able to fund its participation in consultations has little social relevance, societal relevance. I'm not keen to see my tax money being used to fund their participation. Could we consider ending this practice? That was a question. So Rasheen, what do you think?
Well, in fact, I want to say that at ANSES we do not finance participation. We just pay a few train tickets, sometimes flight tickets, so it's just very minimal funding. So they just come on a benevolent basis to participate in the talks. They are not paid, but sometimes I know it's difficult for them because they do not have much funding money, but we still carry on this basis. And there was also a question about consumers' organization, which was for Leonie, but maybe I can say a word about the French case. In fact, we have about 6 to 7 consumer organizations in France. Of course, the most well-known is EFSA Que Choisir, but we have plenty of other ones which are registered with the Ministry of Consumption. And I would say that nearly all of them each organization is involved at one level or the other within the agency. So the question was, do they represent all the consumer views? We can hope so, because we have all the tendencies, I would say, about the consumer groups involved at one stage or the other.
So, other other comments regarding this, all kinds of groups, and do you pay them for being part of a consultations, or how do you do that?
We don't currently pay our patient and consumer representatives to participate in our working party. We do, however, reimburse travel and expenses for their trips into London, where we're currently based, if they're not linked to an organisation. So it does just facilitate that travel if they aren't part of an organisation.
Yeah, it's a similar approach for us, that they are reimbursed for their expenses, but not paid in a sense, although that was by some criticized by some stakeholders, because they say you also have to take into account that you're losing a day of work, and again then the argument was made for some organizations that's very easy, whereas for some small NGO or whatever that's very challenging actually. But then others said that, well, we would never ever take your money anyways, because that would detriment our own independence. So you can probably again not satisfy everyone, whatever you do. Regarding the consumer associations, I mean, I was reporting on the feedback we received and from some of the stakeholders. I think you probably need both. You need to find, I think there's a lot of value in consumer associations, and they do represent, you would hope, to some extent, the consumer perspective. But I would, at least that's what my data suggests, you probably also need to think about other formats that kind of engage the wider public.
Right, thank you. So I would like a concluding question to ask all of you about if you have just one single best piece of advice when it comes to how best to engage stakeholders in regulatory sciences. What would be your very best advice, Regine?
Well, I would like to go back to a person I quoted, Mr. Spiegelhager, on the first day, which really impressed me. It's about humility of science and gaps of knowledge. And the thing we have to really, it's not just bottom-up risk communication. We also have to hear expectations coming from society, and also acknowledge that some methods, sometimes we have limits. For example, I would say in chemicals, in these substances, in co-exposition, in dose level, and weight of evidence. So we have to convey these things to civil society. That would be my recommendation.
Okay. Do you have one single best piece of advice, Melanie?
Yes, I'm glad it's not a one-word answer, but I'll try and be very brief. And I think I would have to say to promote mutual understanding of the added value, because we're very good at talking about how we engage, but I think it really is understanding why it's important. That would be the single most important thing I'd say.
Thank you.
I would like to rephrase the question in how to continuously engage, or how to continue to engage stakeholders. I think it might be very easy to engage stakeholders at one certain moment, but to get them, in fact, have feedback all the time. So I think feedback, in fact, to the stakeholders of what you have been doing as an organization with their advice or with their input is very essential.
Okay, thank you. And Leonie?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be sneaky, try to put three things. So one is very related, I think, to what you said. So you have to ensure that you have the support in your organization to do what you're doing, I think, and the openness and the mindset in the organization for stakeholder engagement. Then you have to really carefully evaluate your position in the field. What are the demands on you? Which are the issues you have to engage more carefully? Where maybe is it not so controversial? And then communicate very well throughout the process, including all the kind of challenges and limitations it has. So I think one of the questions was, how do you kind of keep stakeholders on the ball if the impact is limited and the representativeness is limited? And many stakeholders said actually that they understand that there have to be limitations, but what they want to see is communication. Who has been included, why, and to what extent. And many actually also said that they want to get the feeling to be treated with respect. So I think that's also something maybe we all have to think about.
Okay, so thank you so much, and a big applause for your contributions. Thank you. And you. So, So we will continue. We've listened to some more examples on how to engage. And next up, just looking at my paper, so if I'm the right person, would be Michele Patel. Michele, who heads the social science function at the Food Standards Agency in the UK. And I think you will speak about more practical social research strategies to explore trust in food and its regulator. Please.
Just get this thing working. Good afternoon, everybody.
It should be in just reframing the pictures.
Excellent. I'll go back. There we are. First of all, and I'm aware of my time limitations, I wanted to say thank you to EFSA and to Barbara for the opportunity to speak here today and to attend this excellent conference. To hear the issues of science and values and trust being debated at this level and this scale is really inspiring, so chapeau to you. We think about trust an awful lot in the organisation. The reason for this is we were set up to represent the consumer interest when it comes to food. Now, I feel really privileged sitting here and listening to this because there is not any argument between where I am that to represent the consumer interest you have to have the wherewithal to understand it. And so I would like to talk to you about some of the practical methodologies we've used over the past few years to understand the citizens' connection to food, the food system, how we can start to build this trustworthiness that we've been talking about a lot, and some of the pitfalls and some of the ways that you can overcome those that we've discovered. It is an ongoing project and a bit of a labour of love for me. Because the truth is that most people, certainly in England and Wales and Northern Ireland, don't know how the food comes to be on their plates. And this disconnect breeds some sense of anxiety. We know that people worry about it. We know that people worry about their ability to connect with it. And they delegate trust to make sure that everything that they're feeding themselves and their children is okay to us and to the industry that provides the food that they buy. And we need to demonstrate consistently that we deserve that trust. And I was really pleased to hear Professor Spiegelhalter talking on the first day about the work of Baroness Nora O'Neill, whose work on trustworthiness has really informed quite a lot of our current thinking on this. And for us, this basis of science and evidence helps us to deserve that trust. And engaging with consumers on that science and evidence helps us to maintain our trustworthiness. But to do that, we do need to sometimes communicate the honesty of uncertainty. And that's complicated too. Very quickly, and I'm not going to run through all of these things because I hate it when people read their slides out, we can all read. We're trusted more than most government institutions in the UK. We're trusted more than the food industry is. And these levels of trust cannot be taken for granted. They have been lower. They were certainly lower around the horse meat incident. They have come back to pretty much an all-time high, for which we are duly thankful. And this has obvious implications, which we've discussed over the past 3 days, for science, for scientists, for policymakers, and it has particular implications for food. Because food, and which is why it is so fascinating, but food is one of the most emotional, cultural, values-laden, economic, ethnic, you name it, there is always a social dimension to food. So maintaining trust in food, trust in what you say about food, trust in the science of food, is complex, because trust is complex. In this complicated global system of food that we all operate in, this idea of trust being necessary but a risk is something that we take particularly to heart. And we set out to really understand where this connection with food came from. And what we found was really interesting. Now, all of this is published. I'm not going to run through the data. You can have a look at it on our website or come to me later and I'll show you where it is. But this narrative of trust in crisis that people are talking about, the Edelman Trust Barometer, it's really interesting when you look at it, because actually what we're looking at is a general erosion of trust and a big dip in the US. Now, this is something that we really should be thinking about, But it hasn't just happened over the past 18 months. This is something that's been happening over time. I think it is indicative of this change from a deferential to a referential society. And you could argue that actually it's good for democracy on a certain level. We went out a few years ago now to understand what the consumer wanted out of the future of food. And we presented, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodologies very quickly. And do tell me if I'm running out of time. Lovely. We used public dialogues to discuss with people at length and in depth in 4 different countries, because Scotland were included in this at the time, what sort of future they wanted, using scenarios from the Food Ethics Council piece of work on the future of food. Looking at whether the intersection of technology, the trend towards more local eating, the reduction of meat, how people were going to respond to that, what were their hopes and fears and their aspirations, and we found some really interesting things out about that. What was also interesting was the amount of interest that was generated in the general public. So we've been talking about how hard it is to engage the public. When we held an event in London to discuss this with stakeholder groups, we had more than 2,000 people streaming it live online, and we had hundreds of questions sent in on Twitter from the general public, which we then sought to answer live on the day. It was quite an undertaking, quite an investment, and quite worth it. What we discovered, among many things in that study, was what people wanted and what they hoped for. But we also discovered that there was this real anxiety about the loss of connection to food and a real desire for transparency from the industry. So we then went out to do some more work, and this was done through qualitative citizens forums, so iterative focus groups held over a couple of days with 2 weeks in between to give people a chance to give us their first impressions, and then some reflection time, and then some more reasoned, reflective response to things. We found that actually when you went back to them and said, right, you've told me you want to know what's in your food, what's in your dinner. What do you want to know? And how much of it do you want to know? And what do you want to know first? People become very overwhelmed. We were really surprised by the outcome of this piece of work because we thought it would be easy. We thought we'd be able to then wave it around and say, you know what, tell people what's going on and trust will be built, oh business brand. Actually, it's a lot more complicated than that, so I want to get to that bit. What we found was actually that by bombarding people with information, you overwhelm people. You need to find out what people, how people can best process this stuff. I am not going to say, if Tracy Brown's in the room, don't worry, I'm not going to say it's too complicated. What I'm going to say is that there is a skill to communicating, and it is worth investing in working out how best to do this, because you end up making an investment over the long term in your own trustworthiness. And I think we've all decided over the course of the past 3 days that that is the spirit of the age. So then we went into another project, which was how do we best understand trustworthiness? You know, building on the work of Baroness O'Neill, building on all of the stuff that's been written, and we did a literature review, which has just been published, so recently that it isn't in my abstract, but I can certainly point you to it. And then we did some qualitative research to understand with consumers, again, this deliberative process over a few weeks, how we could get to the bottom of these, of what is behind their trust, or lack thereof, in food, the food system, the food industry, and in us. We're going to follow this up with some quantitative research in our flagship random probability survey, Food and You, which is in field right now. And we are putting this as a piece of sort of strategic evidence into our board discussion around Christmas time, so that our board will make a comment and a decision, and it will all be published. What I wanted to talk to you about, well, there's a couple of things. First off, what we found out about trust was that there were 2 things that really operate in the way of food. There's social trust, which is someone's approximation of your intent, and there is a cognitive trust, which is how competent they think you are at delivering it consistently. Trust can maintain a little bit of a dent on the cognitive trust. People make mistakes. Things go wrong. You cannot maintain a dent on social trust. If people think that you haven't got their best interests at heart, that you haven't shared and aligned with their values, and it is so crucial to understand them, the reputation of your organisation, the credibility of your work, the licence you have to operate will be irrevocably damaged, and that is important. If I may, I'm just going to finish on this one slide. This is one thing I really wanted to share. Over the past few days, I debated whether to leave this one in, and this is actually one of the more important ones. This is the journey that our people go on consistently in the qualitative research that we do with these deliberative groups. It's too complex, I can't engage with it, is the immediate effect, right? And we've all experienced that, and we're all going, well, this is why we don't engage. People get through it. And when you bring them through it, and you have this conversation, and you have it speaking like a human, as Tracy would say, actually, where you end up is a situation where trust in the person having that dialogue with them and their measurement of your good intent towards them increases far beyond where it was in the first place. So you're taking people from a point of maybe blind faith to a point of actually informed trust. And that is an investment in trustworthiness that I think that we could all think about. That's me done. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Didier Verlot, who is heading the unit for assessment and methodological support at the EFSA. Please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation at the EFSA conference. I'm going to talk about optimizing scientific value through engagement with society. So addressing here it's not a sign, one of the whys that we engage with society. In EFSA, as mentioned in the opening speech of our executive director, we determined that the scientific value of our outputs has 4 components. So the degree of transparency, the degree of engagement, the degree of impartiality, and the degree of methodological rigor that we need to produce a fit-for-purpose risk assessment. Now, we heard a lot about transparency and engagement during the day already. What do we mean with impartiality? And I have to read it because it's very complicated working definition, is the extent to which bias due to preconception or expectations owing to any prior knowledge or type of interest is minimized in the process. It translates to plan before you do. So how can we really maximize this impartiality? Then methodological rigor is the degree to which random and systematic error are minimized, or the representativeness and generalizability are maximized, and also uncertainty is taken into account. So those 4 factors determine the scientific value of our outputs. The remit of my talk, the territory of my talk today will be after when the mandate arrives in EFSA, so when we start really this problem formulation and protocol development, the planning of the phase, then the execution, so how then the evidence is assessed, critically appraised and integrated, and then the publication of the results. I'm not going to talk about the white boxes on how the mandate came alive. It's only 9 minutes or 7. So, if you already don't really understand what I'm talking about and how I frame it, I try to also put it more in the context of what has been said this morning. So how the road via transparency and engagement, how it leads to scientific value. So transparency goes, I was very happy with the word cloud this morning that transparency lighted up there, because otherwise I had to redo everything. So transparency leads effectively to engagement, which because of this whole of consultation going then to working together, so from information consultation to participation, and then the information that comes out of this for EFSA goes from data to evidence to knowledge. I'm also quoting David Spiegelhalter, but I even had a picture from the opening session. So I will bring forward some actions that we took to really transparency actions that according to my presentation and to me, feed directly into the engagement. And please check the box if this is an intelligent transparency. So if this is about accessible, is this transparency does it mean accessible? Is it intelligible? That's a difficult word for simple, understandable. Is it usable? And is it accessible? Can you really address and assess the value of this information? Now, there are several transparency actions here listed that are leading to engagement. All of them are related with a specific part of the risk assessment process, this risk assessment process which is in the middle. I won't go through the whole list, but the EFSA journal, please, if you didn't visit yet the EFSA journal stand, it's out there in the main hall where all our outputs are published. In terms of data which is used, in terms of which information is feeding into these risk assessments, we have now opened completely our data warehouse, completely within the limits of the regulation that we have to work under, which is accessible. You can query the data warehouse. We are doing a lot of efforts now, as Robert Medlin said in the meeting here next door. It's nice what you're doing, but it needs to be some steroids pumped in. So we are pumping in steroids to make it also completely machine readable, and we are connecting with the European data portals and other portals. Models that we have been using in our risk assessment or specific guidance document are available online as web tools, accessible for everybody. You just only need to register. You can use those models. You don't need a specific software to run it. It runs in your web browser. I will skip this. All the evidence and tools which are used in our risk assessments are now also published in the Knowledge Junction, which is a CERN-developed platform by CERN, which we also mentioned this morning, where we now provide, so all the evidence, the models, the code of the models, everything is available in this Knowledge Junction, in the Knowledge Junction, and completely traceable because it receives a digital object identifier, and it's linked then also to the opinion. Explaining also what we are doing, how we are doing. We are also making understanding science videos, just one of our social media activities, not only on things like allergies or novel foods, but also on specific methods on how things are dealt with. How do we optimize impartiality by engaging with society? And here I want to really focus on consultation at the different, we have consultation at different stages of the risk assessment, but I want to focus on the public consultation on protocols. Because protocols are the planning, the material methods in terms of what data is needed, inclusion, exclusion criteria, methods. How will we appraise this data? How will we integrate it? How will we take into account the uncertainty? And also knowledge on how to deal with the risk assessment. This is the plan, the backbone of the risk assessment. We are now more and more engaging in public consultations on those protocols. There has been, and also not only public consultation, but also meetings with stakeholders and with society in general. There was on sugars and food, there was one on the BPA recently, and there has been one on the sodium dose DRVs. Now, in the future, this will be more and more implemented also. So during those public consultations meetings, society, stakeholders can provide feedback on what data is collected, they can feedback on the plan, on the appraising of the evidence, and on the analyzing and integration of the evidence to draw conclusions. So, how can we now optimize methodological rigor through engagement? So the one was about how to optimize impartiality through engagement. Now, how can we optimize methodological rigor through engagement? And I want to here give some, there are consultations on the methods. We organize public consultations on methods. We organize workshops. As Barbara mentioned earlier, also there's the BFR conference, joint BFR-EFSA conference on the uncertainty in communication guidance. There are specific colloquia, but as a rule, every guidance document which describes a method in this risk assessment process goes for public consultation, which allows then society to be really involved in the development of the methods. Crowdsourcing. Next door, people are talking a lot about crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing to feed into new methods, to really optimize the methodological rigor. We have did several exercises in crowdsourcing, for example. It's extremely interesting. For example, this was a crowdsourcing exercise, a kind of competition between whoever wanted to apply on how to visualize uncertainty linked to maps. But this is not the result. These are the solvers who are involved all over the world, were involved in providing a solution for this problem. Now, the results coming out of this, it was an ideation, so people had to come up with a possible idea. There were musicians who proposed on how things could be done with sound. It was very, well, creative. There was quite some very nice ideas. Also, one of the winners on how to use virtual reality to really visualize this uncertainty. And then also the winning idea, we developed then further in our in-house and to a working solution, which then directly also has an application then further in EFSA. We have the EU Datathon, where we provide now, this is ongoing, and the 2nd of October, it's in Brussels, the finale, where we provided 2 main databases and basically asked the crowd, what can you do with it? How can you really combine this? Show some innovation, and this is. And yeah, EFSA for the People, an app which has been developed during a hackathon 2 years ago, is available on the online store, and it provides a creative way also to look at our register of questions, which, if you would access it normally online, is a rather dull-looking thing. But here, I mean, those developers really made it accessible and interesting. So, again, to create engagement further. And with this, yeah, well, I think I have to stop anyway, so it's right on time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Didier. We will listen to one more speaker before starting with discussions again. So I would like to introduce to you Davide Lecchini, who is director at one of the offices at the Italian Ministry of Health, dealing with food safety, risk assessment, communication, and I think other stuff as well. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Put them further down, I think. Right.
Such a way, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here and having shown attention to the role and the position of a central and competent authority in managing communication and releasing information. Of course, I'm representing an institutional body that has a role, a public role in the administration of official controls, and of course the point of view is not coming from a technical or scientific body. That's why the aspects are different and sometimes really peculiar. I would like to start from a point that the Ministry of Health has recently realized, and it's that is not possible nowadays to avoid to consider what communication is and the ways to release information about risk assessment and risk management. Of course, we are living in a post-trust society where the heuristic approach is sometimes prevailing, and on the contrary of what has been done by the central competent authorities so far, now it's released that investing and targeting a balanced way to communicate, to release information about food safety is an essential point, giving an important added value. Also because at international level, and European level I'm referring to, the debate and negotiate taking into account pieces of legislation is today crucial. As you all know, now important parts of the legislative acts, I'm referring to the refit of General Food Law and legislative act on the food and feed crisis management, are dedicated to the modality and to the criteria how to manage the communication. As far our role, of course, we have tried to provide all the levels of the administration with communicators and trying to create a network working together and being strictly linked either at a central level, regional level, and local level. At central level, since a few years, the National Committee for Food and Safety is acting, trying to manage the questions related to food safety in a balanced way as regards to communication. The CNSA is divided in two sections. The first section, completely institutional, where the issue related to food safety are managed, and the section 2, dedicated completely to the external world, to the institution. I'm referring to Consumer and Producer Association, Ministries of Economic Development, Foreign Affairs, Agriculture, and state regions. In this venue, public institutions and associations address food safety issues in order to facilitate the exchange of information and to increase the awareness and the ability of the citizens in view of a correct food supply and a conscious food consumption. Awareness is the key word here. The attempt is to be inclusive and to raise the participation of the external world, stakeholders, of course, and the actors already indicated, to the public process of risk assessment and communication. Some results of the advisory section that in September 2017 released a guidance document where the message is propose communication instead of following it. It has been common during last years to see on the social networks and TV media and newspapers, old broadcasts, a communication misleading, not transparent, and administered not by the right actors for giving out a reliable communication. How and what? How? One of the how has been the improving of the portal of the Ministry of Health that has been completely restructured, becoming more friendly and adaptive. Other initiatives by our side, a survey that has been acted by the advisory section of the CNSA, and the risk communication in health and animal welfare and food safety, a training course targeted to public services and private services active in the food sector, trying to improve this balance of the ways how to make communication with the involvement of stakeholders, representatives of consumers, producer association, food bloggers, and so on. Some results coming from the questionnaire. Of course, the risk communication is perceived by the food business operators, citizens, and people interviewed as very important because you could read here some reasons because it's felt really important. For instance, it ensures adequate and correct information to citizens about the food business operators, strengthen the competitiveness, and so on. Protection of citizens and consumer health, many reasons that could suggest to the political level and decision makers to invest in such a kind of activity. Citizens are really interested in risk communication and are feels not involved. The informational tools more relevant, of course, are TV broadcast, online newspaper, and newspapers. Interception of the needs of stakeholders. It's important. We concluded that it's essential to have omnicomprehensive information and communication. That's why one of the results of the survey has targeted some action that we need in this activity. Fake news. We had experience with fake news. The former governments organized some initiative amongst the initiatives, a national conference in Rome with the possibility to have conclusions how to manage fake news. And future development, how to monitor the goals. then testing, involving and making competence more responsible, stimulating greater participation of consumer association, etc., etc. Anyway, the topic is quite critical, themes to be explored, but we are confident to have some results in a short and medium term, but the important things that is that the political level is interested to deepen the topic and to be available to invest in this area. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Davide. Okay, so I would like to ask you to stay. And yeah, that's fine, that's fine. And we will have the speakers from before, as well as 2 tables, so we have something to gather around. Please do continue to submit your comments and questions, and they will feed into the discussion. So we'll have first the tables, and then the speakers. Please. And you have to share those microphones. I think that will be fine. And Davide in the middle? That's fine? Yes, right? No. Please come forward. Yes. So we have again Michele Patel from the Food Standards Agency, Didier Verlot from EFSA, Davide Lecchini from the Italian Ministry of Health, and Tracy Brown from Sense About Science. One question I would like to start with is when, I mean, at which stages of the assessment, risk assessment process do you think that public engagement is needed and is good to have? Who would like to start on that one?
Okay, well, you know what I'm going to say.
Before you start.
Before you start,
right.
yeah. I think that's the thing is, if you wait until you have a self-electing public responding to an issue, then you're going to run into all of the issues that people have been speaking about this afternoon of a small sample of the population and a very kind of skewed version of the debate. I think that is important to deal with, people who are motivated to be part of your discussion. That's not to be ignored or played down. But I think you need to have a sense of context before you start any discussion or any regulatory process. You should understand the context. In fact, it's a bit of a campaign of mine now that when you write the rationale for doing a piece of research of any kind, when you write the introduction to write-up of research or anything like this, you shouldn't just write an account of the science that's gone before. You should actually write an account of what the current discussion is about this field. And I think, an understanding of the regulatory environment is really important. If people don't understand your role as a regulator, then they're not going to understand how you're going to go about looking at a subject. So you need that context right at the beginning, I think.
Thank you. Please.
Can I just add on to that one? I think I completely second everything Tracy says, and I think you should be listening throughout. So listen before. Otherwise, you are risking making science in a vacuum. And I think one of the things we've been talking about over the past 3 days is how that is limited. Listen to people as you're developing it, and listen to what happens when it lands, because we can only manage 3 things really, which is what's in it, what's on it, and what people are going to do about it. And that third one is actually the factor that affects the other 2 sometimes. So we try to have an open, ongoing listening strategy, regardless of the sort of tactical implementation of a particular intervention or something.
Do you want to add to that during which stages, or?
Yes.
Not only before,
as I understood, it's important now before and during the risk assessment process, as you said also. I want to reiterate what I have been said in my talk also, the importance to really consult and engage with society when the plan is there also for the risk assessment. So really when there's an opportunity to, well, to engage society in how the risk assessment will be conducted, what kind of evidence will be needed, how the methods are fitting together. So there's a big importance there.
Before, yes, before, theoretically before, but I think that a reasonable point of start should be case by case. Case by case, depending on what we have to face on. For instance, in case of emerging threats, it's an action that could be coupled with preparedness and reaction. Communication should be not neglected and should have a big importance in certain occasion and treated and managed just as said, case by case, depending some factors.
Yes. There's a lot of questions coming up now. It's about engagement with different categories, like industry stakeholders, food bloggers are being mentioned, and also politicians, and the balance between risk assessors and politicians. So is there any group that you are more interested to discuss? For myself, I think the question of politicians, of course, is interesting because the question is phrased. You might be able to read from there, but I read it anyway. Politicians are often responsible for the multi-criteria decision-making. How much interaction between risk assessors and politicians is acceptable when framing a risk questions? So what do you think? This is a tricky one.
So politicians are always responsible for the multifactorial decision making, not often. I think there is a bit of a challenge at the heart of being a regulator here, which is there's always a desire to turn everything into a preformed process. And I was thinking this when Ellen was presenting earlier today and looking at the different aspects of how the stipulations in law have been interpreted. Because for human engagement, no preformed process is going to be easily justified in every case. I mean, for example, take industry and the role that industry should play. Why would you predetermine that? You know, sometimes jobs are going to be at stake, and that matters hugely. It doesn't matter to people who lobby in Brussels very much, but it matters hugely to those ordinary folk out there, which is most of society. And as a regulator, you need to pay attention to that. But it wouldn't be the same from issue A to issue B. And to have a preformed idea of who you should consult and how in every case is an abdication of responsibility, in fact. And that's what I think that EFSA, like every other regulator, tends towards, is wanting a process that absolves them from making judgments and giving leadership and having accountability. Because all regulators do that, because process is something that you can never be held out, you can never be caught out on. You can never be wrong if you followed the process. But I'm afraid, as a public engagement approach, you need to have judgment and you need to have confidence, which also often means having confidence in some of your own people to make those judgments. And I'm afraid that is the nature of the beast. There will not be a formula that will protect you for every scenario. You have to accept making judgments and responding to the needs of the situation and then being held to account for it. That is the nature of public engagement.
Right. EFSA was being mentioned here. Do you want to? Thank you.
It's very difficult to hear what you were saying here. No, on stage. But I understood that we are leading to a process where there won't be any accountability from our side because we follow the process completely and we engage with society. I would say that no, I mean, the accountability of EFSA's output is EFSA to start with. So this is not the intention at all of this process. So I think we need to communicate better on this, and I guess.
I want you to tell me different.
There's also this question, if engaging more with civil society stakeholders is positive for democracy, I think we all agree on that. What about engaging with industry stakeholders, often seen as undermining the independence of scientists? What are your views about that? Yeah, right, I know, but forward to you.
I don't mind taking this one. I mean, I think that we have to listen. Right, that's my starting point for a lot of things. We should be listening before, we should be listening throughout, we should have been listening anyway. And then we can frame the issue in the context, then we can work out who is the most important of the various people that we're going to have to factor in. Then we can present a well-rounded and intelligent evidence base to those politicians who are going to be making the decision. So, you know, without being funny, it depends. It depends on the stake of the stakeholder. So there will be a time when the people affected most by this will be the industry, and then we should be listening to the people for whom it is the most important. But what we are really clear about is actually that the sort of independent position that we have, the science evidence base that we have, and our ability where necessary to stand up to any stakeholder that we think is not acting in the best public interest is the basis of our license to operate. And you know, any over-reliance or any overdoing of listening to one group over another, any group over another, frankly, undermines our credibility.
The interaction, as already said, should be performed every time, I think, because it allows an added value that otherwise couldn't be profited. The comparison should be always transparent, and the respect of the respective roles should be ensured in every step of the proceedings. Then not so commonly, because we are a public administration, but we are completely open to have this kind of interaction, and it has been demonstrated in our activities in the last years, trying to be inclusive and trying to be trying to share the point of view of the competent central authority and of course the stakeholders and the other side of the moon.
A very specific part of the public would be the bloggers and the influencers within social media. Food bloggers are being mentioned in one of the questions. Could they be part of this stakeholder engagement approach, or how do you deal with those influential people on social media?
Influential people are influential people. So if you're hoping to engage people in the idea, and I'm talking more about talking as well as listening, then in the media landscape that we're in today, you have to, you know, you have to consider that food bloggers are important, but they're not the be-all and end-all. I'm going to go back to the "it depends" argument, really.
Yeah, right.
In terms of crowdsourcing and getting ideas from the public, getting data from the public, the use of influencers might have a value there for the snowballing and really getting people to contribute. So there's a role, yes, there, I see.
But this isn't new. I think we're tending to fetishize social media, but changes in the media landscape happen all the time. And I remember when we were looking at detox diets, which had become really, really fashionable about 10 years ago. And various organizations promoting chemistry had been, and toxicology and dietary advice and so on, had been trying to challenge that. But they'd been trying by sending stuff to the health and science correspondents of the mainstream media. And the reality is, in the UK, for example, as many people read, probably more now, read Sainsbury's magazine, the one that you pick up at the checkout in the supermarket, as read the Times, okay? And that's where you'll find conversations about food fads and things like this. Sainsbury's would hate me to say that, but it's also, I mean, people read
you know, these things in parenting magazines. They read about food behaviours in lifestyle magazines. That's often where things are. So we persuaded the chemical bodies, the Royal Society of Chemistry and others, to start holding their press briefings at 11 a.m. when part-time writers could get into the centre of town from the suburbs. They'd drop the kids off at school, and they could actually make it to a press conference, not at 9 a.m., and to hold them and invite the lifestyle press. And that's made a huge difference. In fact, people who write about skincare and makeup and diet and, you know, summer bodies and all those things actually have been given a new angle on all the press releases they get from the companies and so on, which is to ask, what's the science question here? Which has been interesting and fascinating for them to be able to do that. And you've seen a kind of, almost an empowerment of those writers with those kind of scientific questions. And I think that's not a new thing, that's not to do with social media, that's just about recognizing that people's ideas don't just come from the national press.
I wouldn't know really in this kind of issue. I think in this topic we are certainly to fake news risk. Then I wouldn't know.
This is a conference hosted by EFSA. It's about food safety, and we talk about risk assessment, and there's a question about the separation between risk assessment and risk management. Does it facilitate or hamper stakeholder engagement? Would it maybe be better if risk managers and risk assessors jointly engage with stakeholders within one framework? What do you think? Do you understand what?
Not really, no. I don't think it's very interesting. I think it's really a process question that's not particularly picking up on the themes of the discussion that we've had here, is it? To kind of start writing some sort of formula like this. But
would the one who put the question like to rephrase it or develop it? So we can make use of it? Do you want to address it? Yes. But may I instead ask them, we are sorry, okay, please, help us out.
No, it was meant to raise a problem which has to do with the way risk assessment and risk management are separated in the case of EFSA, and where we have our own stakeholder engagement framework, and the Commission, as the risk managers, have their own stakeholder management framework. And this separation looks a bit unnatural in the sense that it's very clear why assessment and management are separated in terms of science and decision making, but in terms of relating with the stakeholders, the problems are one and the same. And we carry out an engagement process in relation to the assessment side, and they carry out an engagement program in relation to the management side. Does it make sense to have these two moments separated and uncoordinated, uncoherently carried out?
Yes, and you're working yourself at EFSA, right? Yeah. Right. So does it make it clear for you? Yes. Do you want to respond to that one? Or comment on it?
It shouldn't be an internal EFSA discussion, of course, because
but use the mic, otherwise.
It shouldn't be an internal EFSA discussion because the question is coming from a colleague of mine. I agree. It would. That there would be a benefit at it, but at this point, it's not. The discussions take legally place at different levels. So there is a continuous, of course, involvement also of the risk manager in the risk assessment process. So somehow the information flow exists and is there. And also the value of the stakeholder engagement with, from the risk manager with the stakeholders is translated into the mandate that arrives to EFSA.
Yes, sorry. Yes, please.
Thank you. For me, it goes even broader than risk assessment and risk management separation. It's when consumers or citizens are concerned about something that has to do with food, they don't just care about the risk and the food safety risk. There are a lot of values and a lot of interests and a lot of concerns that have to do with sustainability, that has to do with diet, that has to do with so much. And one organization alone cannot address all the answers. And at the same time, it's not acceptable to say, I will just address this a little bit because it's what I'm an expert on. And then you need to go to somebody else to have all the other answers to your questions.
So would the right solution be that you all work together and have this huge stakeholder consultations with different aspects? Or what do you think?
No, but I would say that, as I said before, you know, this is an investment. It's an investment worth making. It's an investment of time on the behalf of the regulator, but also on the behalf of the stakeholders who may have to duplicate some aspects of it. And certainly when you're talking about engaging representatively with the public, that is an investment of time and effort and money and interpretation and iteration and reiteration. And it is worth it, because otherwise you're not listening to the people you serve, you're not understanding the communities that you're seeking to represent. And yeah, there may be process issues that are frustrating, there may be limitations in terms of resource, but I would always back doing it, even if you have to kind of work out how you do it.
Yeah, that's right.
So it may be that there's a specific set of time-saving things that could be done through improving communication between different parts of an organisation and different agencies. But I think there's a more fundamental shift that is going on in regulatory bodies, which is to begin to realise that the people that do that community stuff and that communication stuff are not the people who just fix the computers, right? So that's what it's been seen like for many years. It's like you hire some people in and they know that stuff and you just let them get on with it and they can write some press releases. And that's what a communications role has been seen as, like a set of skills that you hire in, rather than an approach of the organisation that's really integrated from the strategy and the goals at the top of the organisation through everything else that's done. And I think many regulatory bodies are going through a realisation, which means that you have to start to, first of all, trust people in your organisation when they're bringing back that information and informing the way that you work, but also as they integrate it more fully into a strategy. And I think that's probably where the biggest saving is in terms of maximising the benefit to your organisation of the resources that you put into engagement. It's through those internal processes improving right at this point. I'm pretty sure of that.
There's a specific question about crowdsourcing. To achieve credibility in crowdsourcing, how much crowd selection is needed? Would you comment on that?
I will give the crowdsourcing answer. The principle of crowdsourcing is that there is no crowd selection, so otherwise you don't benefit of the crowd. So in terms of crowdsourcing, innovation, knowledge, ideas, data, there shouldn't be any crowd selection, or you just work against the principle of crowdsourcing. Of course, I'm not talking about crowdsourcing EFSA outputs or crowdsourcing risk assessments in general. I'm crowdsourcing on specific topics, specific needs that feed into the risk assessment, methodological or data-wise.
It's a very tiny pilot project, but we're actually looking into answering some of this question by using Zooniverse, the citizen science platform, and comparing the answers we get on that to the same questions asked in a representative survey to see just what the difference is. That's one of many interesting outputs we'll get from this project. It isn't a very big one, but we will be publishing that in about 6 months' time, I should think.
Yeah. Time is always scarce in discussions like this. I would like to ask all of you a concluding question, which actually will be the same as in the previous panel discussion. So would you kind of state in 15, 20 seconds maybe, your best single piece of advice on how to engage the public in regulatory science? That's tough. Tracy.
Do it early.
Do it early.
Do it early.
Yeah, before even. That was short. Thank you.
I think pursuing transparency and improving confidence and trust with the daily actions that the public bodies could perform is still a long process, I think, but some messages are coming that the empatia, if we could say in such a way, could be an area to be developed to profit of the relationships with all the level of the chain involved in the food sector and so on. But anyway, either the competent authority, the public administration, the stakeholders, all the actors participating to the proceeding should be more dedicated one each other to be communicative, to release and spread information, and to take part in circular economy of the communication of the information.
Thank you so much. And your best single piece of advice?
Well, given how I built up the presentation, my answer on transparency wouldn't be a big surprise. So really cultivate, build further on transparency, on the how, the what, and the why you're doing, and that would be my advice.
Thank you.
I would say have lots of real conversations on lots of channels and at scale, and sometimes shut up and listen.
Okay. Thank you so much to you all. A big applause. You can walk if you like. Thank you everyone for all your comments and suggestions and questions, and I hope that the speakers also will be able to address more of them using the conference app. Of course, it's difficult to summarize an afternoon like this, but I think we should give it a try anyway. So if you remember, in the morning session, we made a word cloud together using this conference app. So if you can please log in again, use the app, and it's the same actually question as this morning. Could you, in one word, try to describe what should be an essential element of any public engagement strategy? One word, what should be an essential element of any public engagement strategy? So there will be a word cloud soon. So let's see if we can release all those words, and if there's any specific pattern. Transparency, listening, context, humility, respect. Transparency is leading. I wonder if it's possible to also get the cloud from the morning session, if we can make a comparison between the two of them and see if it... This is a morning part, right? It's transparency, honesty, trust, and then transparency is leading there too. And then you have transparency again in the afternoon. So they are close to each other, but it's not so much about trust as in the morning session. You see, in the afternoon, if you want to try to summarize this, this would be like in transparency and honesty and dialogue, and if we can move back to the other one, participation, listening, openness, and respect, we trust. So thank you, everyone. I would like again to ask Dr. Yongxi Shen to come together with me. And Doctor, you might be able to give some concluding words for the session.
I know the time is late. So I just want to thank you, all the audience, and our speakers and the panelists, and in particular, Cici, who actually chaired and moderated most of the session. And there's one unique feature I noticed in this session is interactive. That's the spirit of what we discussed, engagement. So thank you all, and encourage all of you to go to the poster session, which is now open, and also have a pleasant evening. Thank you.